The conference room went completely silent when Mr. Harlow slammed the employee handbook onto the table. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. 30 people sat frozen around that table. My coworkers, my supervisors, and 2 HR representatives who were quietly pretending to study their notepads. Mr. Harlow pressed his finger down onto the open page like he was delivering some kind of verdict. "If you're going to question management decisions," he said, his voice filling the entire room, "then follow the handbook to the letter." I felt the heat crawl slowly up the back of my neck. He was smiling. That wide, satisfied smile he always wore whenever he had an audience and someone smaller to make an example of. "Every rule," he added, even louder this time. "Exactly as written. No shortcuts. No excuses." A ripple of nervous laughter moved around the table. People were looking at me. Some with pity. Some with clear relief that it was me sitting in that chair and not them. I stared at the handbook sitting in front of me. And that was the exact moment I realized something very important. Mr. Harlow had never actually read it. My name is Nadia Wells, and until that afternoon I had worked at Westford Logistics for 6 years. 6 years of arriving early and leaving late. 6 years of quietly fixing other people's scheduling disasters before anyone else even noticed they existed. 6 years of making sure the entire operations department looked competent while the people above me took the credit. I was not the loud one in meetings. I was not the office favorite who got invited to leadership lunches or mentioned in quarterly reports. I was the one in the background, the one whose name only came up when something needed fixing or, apparently, when someone needed to be blamed. Mr. Harlow had been my department director for 2 of those 6 years. In that time, I had watched him take credit for things he did not do, dodge accountability for things he did, and build a small circle of supervisors who protected him in exchange for the same protection back. It was a system. A comfortable, ugly little system. And until that meeting, I had been too tired and too careful to challenge any of it. The handbook was about to change everything. The shipment error Mr. Harlow blamed on me that afternoon had nothing to do with me. It happened because he approved a last-minute vendor change 3 days before the deadline without informing a single person on the operations team. The company system flagged the change immediately. I saw the flag, tried to correct it within my own authority, and escalated it the proper way. But the delivery still fell behind schedule. And when the client complained, Mr. Harlow needed somewhere to point. He pointed at me. In front of 30 people, with HR sitting in the room, he told everyone that my poor coordination and failure to follow procedure had caused the entire delay. He used the word sloppy. He used the word unreliable. He did not once mention the vendor change he had quietly approved without telling anyone. After the meeting, a coworker named Priya caught up with me near the water cooler. "That was brutal," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Everyone knows it wasn't your fault." I shrugged and told her I was fine. But inside something had shifted. Something quiet and cold had snapped firmly into place. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the employee handbook open in front of me. I had not opened it casually. I opened it the way you read something when you are genuinely looking for a weapon, slowly, page by page, not skipping a single line. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Dress code, leave policy, conduct standards, the usual dry paragraphs that nobody ever actually reads all the way through. Then I turned to Section 4, Compliance Reporting. My stomach dropped. The section stated clearly that all employees were required to document and formally report any policy violations they observed during the course of their employment. Not encouraged. Not suggested. Required. It went further. Failure to report a known violation could itself result in disciplinary action against the employee who stayed silent. I read the whole section twice. Then a third time. Then I sat back in my chair and thought about what I had personally watched happen in our department over 6 years. The small rule bending. The approvals that bypassed the proper process. The time cards quietly adjusted as personal favors. Our department broke these rules constantly. The next morning, I arrived at work 15 minutes early. I opened my computer, pulled up the compliance reporting form linked in Section 4 of the handbook, and started with something small. 3 weeks earlier, I had watched my supervisor, Mr. Patel, manually adjust a time card entry for one of his friends on the floor staff. The adjustment added 40 minutes to a shift that had ended early. I had seen it happen. I had not said anything at the time because it seemed minor, and because that was simply how things worked in our department. But it was against policy. The handbook was completely clear about that. I wrote up the report carefully. I included the date, the names involved, the specific policy reference from Section 4, and a brief factual description of what I had observed. No opinions. No emotions. Just facts. I submitted it through the official HR portal at 8:14 in the morning. Then I made myself a coffee, sat back down at my desk, and waited. I fully expected the report to disappear quietly into some folder that nobody would ever open again. I was wrong about that. 2 days later, an email arrived in my inbox from HR. The sender was Miss Tully, one of the 2 HR representatives who had been sitting quietly at the back of the conference room during Mr. Harlow's performance. I had never received a direct email from her before in 6 years. The message was short. Almost too short. Thank you for your compliance submission, Ms. Wells. Your report has been formally logged in the compliance tracking system. Please continue to report any future observations per handbook policy. I read it 3 times. What caught my attention was one specific word. Logged. Not reviewed. Not dismissed. Not quietly filed away somewhere unreachable. Logged. In a tracking system. Which meant the report had an official timestamp. It had a reference number. It existed in a place that someone above Miss Tully could access if they ever decided to look. It was a small thing. One entry in a database. But it meant my documentation was now part of an official record that the company itself maintained. And if I kept adding to that record, at some point it would become impossible for anyone to ignore. Once I started paying close attention, I could not stop seeing it. The thing about working in the same place for 6 years is that you stop noticing the small ways people bend the rules. It becomes background noise. Something normal. Just the way things get done around here. But I was looking now. Really looking. I saw managers editing their own expense submissions after the fact to adjust amounts that had already been approved. I saw supervisors signing off on vendor invoices without going through the review process the handbook clearly required. I noticed safety inspection logs being completed days after the actual inspections had taken place, which meant the recorded dates were simply false. None of it felt enormous on its own. Each individual thing seemed like something a reasonable person could explain away with a quick excuse or a tired laugh. But the handbook did not make exceptions for small violations or convenient ones. Section 4 required documentation of all observed policy violations. So I documented them. Every single one. Date, time, names involved, policy reference, brief factual description. Submitted through the proper channel. Quietly. Professionally. Without a single word of drama. 2 weeks after I filed my first report, Mr. Harlow appeared at my desk. He did not sit down. He stood over me the way he always did when he wanted to remind you of the distance between his position and yours. His arms were crossed. His expression was somewhere between annoyed and cautious, like he was trying to work out how much I knew before deciding how to respond. You've been filing a lot of compliance reports lately, he said. His voice was flat and controlled, feeling out the situation one careful word at a time. I looked up from my screen and smiled. It was a small, polite, completely unbothered smile. You told me to follow the handbook, I said. A muscle along his jaw tightened noticeably. He looked at me for a moment longer than felt comfortable, then straightened up and walked away without another word. I turned back to my computer. Technically, I had done nothing wrong. I had not broken a single rule. I had not threatened anyone or spread rumors, or caused any obvious disruption. I had simply done exactly what the employee handbook required of me. Exactly like he asked. Something interesting began to happen in the weeks that followed. Word traveled the way it always does in a workplace. Quietly, through lunch conversations and glances across cubicles and whispered exchanges near the printer. People began to understand that I was filing compliance reports. Not because I announced it, but because the pattern had become obvious to anyone who was paying attention. And something in the department shifted. Managers who used to casually bend the rules in plain sight started double-checking themselves. A supervisor who had always signed off on invoices without reviewing them suddenly began asking for backup documentation before approving anything. The informal time card adjustments that used to happen openly started happening behind closed doors, and then stopped happening anywhere I could see at all. Nobody confronted me directly. Nobody threatened me. But the quiet woman from operations, the one who fixed schedules, cleaned up messes, and never made noise, was suddenly making experienced managers genuinely uncomfortable. That was a new feeling for me. Not a cruel one. Not a power-hungry one. Just the steady, grounded feeling of someone who finally understood exactly how much she had always been underestimated. Then I noticed something much bigger. About a month into my documentation routine, I was reviewing a set of vendor invoices as part of my standard operations work when a pattern jumped out at me immediately. Mr. Harlow had been approving business lunches with a company called Pinnacle Supply Solutions. Not occasionally. Consistently. Almost once every 2 weeks for at least 8 months straight. The amounts were always significant, never quick coffee meetings, but they were always submitted at amounts just slightly below the threshold that required a second approval signature. Always just under the limit. Every single time, without exception. I pulled the full records going as far back as my access allowed. The pattern held perfectly across every entry. It looked deliberate. It looked exactly like someone who knew precisely where the policy line was drawn, and was making a careful point of staying just one careful step below it. I checked Section 4 again and cross-referenced 3 other sections of the handbook. This violated multiple policies at once. Vendor relationship disclosure, approval process requirements, conflict of interest documentation standards. I compiled every invoice I had access to, wrote the report carefully, and submitted it. That was when I found the second rule. I had been so focused on Section 4's basic reporting requirements that I had not read closely enough through the paragraphs that followed. But after the Pinnacle Supply report, I went back and read every single line again from the beginning. Buried inside subsection 4.7 was a procedure I had completely missed on my first reading. Once 5 or more related policy violations involving the same individual or department had been formally logged and documented through the official compliance system, HR was required to escalate the full file directly to the Corporate Compliance Office. Not permitted to. Not encouraged to. Required to. The language was just as clear and direct as the original reporting requirement had been. Corporate compliance had to be formally notified and provided with all documentation once that specific threshold was crossed. I sat very still at my desk for a long moment. Then I pulled up my compliance submission history and counted carefully, checking which reports had been logged against the same department and the same individuals. I had already reached 4. I needed exactly 1 more. My heart was beating faster than I expected it to. The 5th violation arrived without me having to look very hard. 2 days after I discovered the escalation clause, I was going through the monthly safety checklist records as part of my regular operations duties. It was routine work, the kind of task assigned to the quiet, reliable person because nobody ever thinks it carries any real importance. It carried a great deal of importance that particular afternoon. One of the required safety inspections for our loading zone had a sign-off date recorded as the 14th. But I had been in that part of the building for most of the afternoon on the 14th. The inspection had not taken place on the 14th. Based on what I had directly seen and could confirm, it had taken place on the 16th, 2 full days later, and someone had simply written the 14th on the official form regardless. A falsified date on an official safety record. I documented it with the same careful format I had used every time before. Date, policy reference, factual description, supporting context. I submitted the report at 4:47 on a Tuesday afternoon. Then I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The threshold had been crossed. 3 days after I submitted the 5th report, an email arrived that I had not fully expected. It was not from Ms. Tully in HR. It was not from anyone in our building. The sender's name was Mr. Dean, and his email signature identified him as a senior investigator with Westford Logistics Corporate Compliance. The message was professional and carefully brief. He had been assigned to review a documented compliance file originating from our department. He wanted to schedule a call to ask clarifying questions and request access to any supporting documentation I had personally retained. My hands were steady as I read it, but my heart was doing something entirely different. I responded the same afternoon. I confirmed I was fully available. I told him I had retained organized copies of all relevant documentation, including dated records, submission confirmations, and the specific handbook sections referenced in each individual report. 3 days later, we had a 40-minute phone call. He asked careful, specific questions. I answered every single one honestly. I did not exaggerate anything. I did not speculate beyond what I personally knew. I told him exactly what I had seen and precisely when I had seen it. Exactly 1 week after my phone call with Mr. Dean, 2 people I had never seen before walked into the Westford Logistics office. They arrived at 9 in the morning, signed in at the front desk, and were escorted directly to a conference room on the 2nd floor. They carried laptops and document folders and wore the kind of calm, neutral expressions that gave absolutely nothing away to anyone watching them. Nobody in the department knew who they were or why they had come. Except me. Mr. Harlow seemed more puzzled than worried at first. I watched him through the glass wall of his office as he tried quietly to get information from the front desk coordinator. He was told only that the visitors were from corporate, and that they had requested access to certain departmental records. His expression shifted from puzzled to uncertain. Then, about an hour into their visit, one of the compliance officers walked directly to his office doorway and asked for full access to expense approval records from the past 12 months. The look on his face in that moment, the exact second when he understood what was actually happening, was something I will not forget for a long time. The investigators did not limit themselves to my reports. That became clear very quickly. They had arrived with a broader mandate than I had anticipated. Once they were given access to the department's expense approval records, they began pulling related files, emails, vendor contracts, purchase orders, internal communications going back nearly 2 years. My direct role in the process was already finished in the most important sense. The documentation I had submitted had done exactly what it was designed to do. But I could clearly see the shape of what was unfolding from my desk. The Pinnacle Supply Solutions lunches were only one thread in a much larger and older pattern. The investigators were pulling on that thread and discovering it connected directly to other things. Invoices approved at unusual speeds. Vendor contracts awarded without going through the standard competitive review process. Written communications that suggested prior personal relationships that had never once been disclosed. What had started with a single time card adjustment and a few expense policy violations was beginning to look like something significantly more serious than anyone in the department had prepared for. The paper trail was much longer than anyone had expected. The atmosphere in the department changed almost overnight. Within just a few days of the investigators arriving, meetings started getting canceled. Not rescheduled, canceled outright with no explanation given to anyone. People who had always moved through the building with easy, casual confidence started walking differently. Quieter. More careful about who they made eye contact with in the hallway. Mr. Harlow barely spoke at all anymore. He had stopped coming near my desk entirely. On the rare occasions we ended up in the same hallway or break room, he looked directly through me rather than at me. Not with the old anger. With something I could only describe as calculation, like he was trying to figure out exactly how much I knew and how much damage had already been done. The answer, of course, was that it did not matter anymore what I personally knew. Everything that mattered was already documented and already in the hands of people well above his reach. Other managers began behaving strangely as well. Side conversations dropped to nothing the moment certain people walked past. Priya told me quietly one afternoon that 2 supervisors had started deleting old emails. It was far too late for that. Miss Tully from HR had made a mistake that I believe she did not fully understand until the investigators pointed it out to her directly. For years, minor policy violations in our department had been brought to her attention informally, not always in writing, but in the way concerns get mentioned in passing. A quiet word in the hallway. A vague note. An email that described a problem without ever using the word complaint. She had handled all of it the same way every time. She smoothed things over. She encouraged people to be team players. She reminded everyone that maintaining good working relationships was essential for the department to function. None of those conversations had ever been formally logged. None had ever been escalated anywhere. That was now a serious institutional problem. Because I had formally logged my reports. I had followed the exact process the handbook described in detail. And the handbook was unambiguous. HR was required to escalate documented violations once the defined threshold was reached. By not doing the same with concerns that had come to her before mine, she had created an official gap between what the handbook required and what had actually happened. The investigators noticed that gap immediately and documented it carefully. Then the investigation uncovered something that changed the entire scale of what was happening. I found out about it the same way most people in the department did, through a conversation I was not supposed to overhear. Two of the compliance investigators were moving past the break room doorway, speaking in low voices. I caught only part of what they said. But the part one caught was more than enough. Pinnacle Supply Solutions, the vendor Mr. Harlow had been taking those careful, just under the limit lunches with consistently for over 8 months, was not an independent company with no ties to anyone in our organization. It was co-owned by a former close friend of Mr. Harlow's from his university days. Nobody at Westford Logistics had ever been informed of that relationship. It had never been disclosed on any vendor application or formal approval. The contracts Pinnacle had received from our company over the past 2 years had bypassed standard competitive review every single time. Every one of those lunches suddenly looked like something else entirely. The word the investigators began using, quietly but clearly, was kickbacks. The room went very still when that word started circulating through the building. The private interviews started at the beginning of the 3rd week. The investigators set up in the 2nd floor conference room and worked through the department methodically, one person at a time. The sessions were individual and confidential. Nobody was told what anyone else had said. Each person came out looking slightly more shaken than they had looked going in. My session was on a Wednesday morning. Mr. Dean led the interview personally. He was professional and unhurried. He asked me to walk him through my entire documentation process from the very beginning, why I started what I had observed, and how I had organized and kept my records. He asked about the Pinnacle invoices specifically and in detail. He asked whether I had raised concerns with Mr. Harlow or any supervisor before beginning to file formal reports. I answered every question carefully and completely honestly. I did not add anything that went beyond what I had directly observed. I did not speculate about motivations or outcomes. I stated facts, provided dates, and referenced the specific handbook sections that had guided my actions at every step. By the time all the interviews were finished, the paper trail I had built made it nearly impossible for anyone to claim they simply had not known. By the start of the 4th week, the department felt like a building whose foundation had already cracked clean through. The normal rhythms of the workday had completely disappeared. People sat at their desks and did the minimum necessary to keep operations running, but the informal structures that hold a workplace together, the easy side conversations, the casual cooperation, the unspoken understandings about who was protected and who was not, all of it had dissolved entirely. Trust had collapsed from every direction at once. Supervisors who had always quietly covered for each other were now making careful, deliberate efforts to document their own individual decisions in ways that created clear distance from others. 2 people made separate requests to HR to submit voluntary statements to the investigators. Additional follow-up sessions were scheduled. The compliance officers kept returning to the same central question in every interview they conducted. Why were these violations not reported through proper channels earlier? Nobody had a clean answer to give. The honest answer was the same one I had understood since the night I first sat at my kitchen table with that handbook. Because nobody in this department had ever actually followed Section 4. Until me. On a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week of the investigation, Mr. Harlow walked over to my desk. He looked like a different person entirely. Not just tired, completely hollowed out. The easy confidence that had always surrounded him like a second skin was gone without a trace. He stood at the edge of my workspace without stepping into it, as though there was a boundary he no longer felt he had any right to cross. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "You started this." It was not loud. It was not angry. It was flat and stripped of everything performative, like the last honest thing a person says when there is nothing left to hide behind. I met his eyes and held them. "You told me to follow the handbook," I said. I kept my voice calm. Not cold. Not satisfied. Just steady. Because that was the simple and completely accurate truth of what had happened between us, and there was genuinely nothing more to add to it. He stood there for a few seconds longer. Then he gave one small, barely visible nod and walked slowly away. He never stopped at my desk again after that afternoon. The corporate decision came down at the end of the 4th week. Westford Logistics leadership sent a formal summary of findings to our division, and scheduled a mandatory all-department meeting. It was held in the same conference room where Mr. Harlow had once slammed that handbook onto the table and told me to follow every rule to the letter. I sat down in the same chair I had occupied that day. The compliance director, Ms. Carver, stood at the front of the room. She had the kind of steady, matter-of-fact manner that made everything she said feel inevitable rather than dramatic or personal. She spoke for about 12 minutes. She confirmed that the internal investigation had identified multiple documented violations, including fraudulent expense approvals, failure to follow vendor conflict of interest disclosure requirements, and falsified official safety inspection records. She confirmed separately that HR's consistent failure to escalate prior concerns through proper channels was being treated as a distinct institutional failure, requiring its own corrective action. Then she announced that all findings had been formally referred to the company's legal department and that individual personnel decisions would be communicated privately over the following 48 hours. The room was completely silent throughout. The individual notifications came the following morning. Mr. Harlow was terminated immediately, effective that same day. His access to all company systems was removed before noon. Security returned his personal belongings to him in a box at the front entrance. I did not see him leave the building, but Priya watched from the hallway window and told me about it quietly afterward. 2 supervisors, including Mr. Patel, were suspended pending the outcome of ongoing investigation into specific expense and time card violations. A 3rd supervisor was formally reassigned to a non-management position under active disciplinary review. 2 others received documented written warnings that would remain permanently on their records. Ms. Tully and her direct manager in HR were both replaced. A statement from corporate described the change as a restructuring measure to ensure proper compliance oversight going forward. Within 48 hours of Ms. Carver's meeting, most of the department's entire leadership structure had simply ceased to exist. The handbook Mr. Harlow had slammed onto that conference room table had quietly, methodically, and completely legally dismantled the entire system he had spent years carefully building around himself. Nobody blamed me directly, because every single thing I had done followed company policy exactly. As people cleared out their desks over the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Nobody came to me with open anger. A few people avoided my eyes in the hallway. A few others seemed uncertain about how to behave around me now that everything had changed so dramatically. But there were no confrontations, no hostile notes, no pointed silences engineered to make me feel guilty for what I had set in motion. I thought about that a great deal in the quiet moments, and I believe the reason was straightforward. Everything I had done was completely visible and entirely documented. There was no hidden campaign in it, no manipulation behind closed doors, no private conversations designed to destroy anyone. I had received a direct instruction from my boss in front of 30 witnesses, and I had followed it precisely and openly. The same rules existed for every single person in that building. I had simply been the first one to read them with genuine care. The employees who remained, the ones who had not been part of the misconduct, understood that. Several told me directly that the department had needed something like this for a very long time, that they had been deeply uncomfortable with how things operated but had never once felt safe enough to say anything about it. The handbook had always been there to protect everyone. 3 months after the investigation officially concluded, Westford Logistics completed a full restructuring of the operations department. A letter from the regional director arrived in my inbox on a Monday morning. It confirmed that following the compliance review and the organizational changes that resulted from it, a new position had been created within the division. The role was called Operations Compliance Coordinator. It carried a meaningfully higher salary, direct reporting access to divisional leadership, and a formal mandate to build and maintain a proper compliance culture across the entire department. They offered it to me. I accepted the same day. On my first morning in the new role, a fresh copy of the updated Westford Logistics Employee Handbook was placed on my desk. Someone had already marked certain sections with small colored tabs along the edges. Section 4 still carried the exact same language it had always carried. I smiled when I read it through again. This time, every person in the department would be properly trained on what it said. Every person would understand clearly what it required of them and what it existed to protect. As for Mr. Harlow, I never heard from him again after the afternoon. He quietly nodded and walked away from my desk. Honestly, That silence was the most satisfying part of the entire story.